Bay Area from Cocoa Head to Diamond Head is, there's home breaks for people, and you got to be in the know to know how to go, where to go. And they're not that popular, and you can sometimes be out there and have the place to yourself. Waikiki breaks are more classic breaks. And Ala Moana is like, Ala Moana Bowls was a place that in the summertime pros would surf, so they kept their skill set together to hit pipeline, because it's a left bowling break. So like Jerry Lopez, when he was growing up, he would perfect his tube catching skills at Ala Moana Bowls. So this is why when winter time rolled around, he was like on it.
Right. So when you were growing up in this, growing up there surfing, like as far as like gender, like was it pretty even or
no? No, not at all. But it also, I would never. It wasn't also as crowded as it is today.
Right. Of course.
There were. I'm trying to think how many women I ever saw. Not a lot. Not a lot. It's a little bit.
Were you treated differently?
You know what? I didn't, my surfing was also not as crazy as I am now. And we can talk about how this got reignited. It was real casual. Like when we didn't have surf apps, you heard how big the waves were you could call into a number or on the radio. Like the radio announcers would be like, it's 6 to 8 on the North Shore today and 2 to 3 on the South Shore. And it's great, and that would be like in the middle of in between songs and stuff, they would tell you the surfing.
Love it.
But people didn't really have to pay attention because you could just drive to the nearest wherever and look over to see if the waves were breaking.
Right. So
like on the South Shore, the waves break a lot farther out in the ocean because the barrier reef on the South Shore is further out. Like the North Shore, the reef is kind of, some of it's closer to the beach, some of it's farther out to the beach, right? And you have all those different breaks, outer reef breaks, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But it has to be big enough to come into those to really break. But so on the South Shore, you're always looking at least a mile out from shore. So you're guessing at how big the waves might be based on the amount of whitewash you can see. You know what I mean? So the best place that people would go to figure out how big the waves were coming in on the South Shore was Diamond Head Lookout. So you would drive up to Diamond Head and you would look over because you have this above ground view. Plus Diamond Head will always pick up a swell no matter how bad it is. And I don't know if it's somewhat of a point, although it's not a point break. And you could kind of see, well, if it's breaking at Diamond Head, the winds look like this. Okay, maybe you'll go to, the Ala Moana side, or maybe you'll go home side, in the valleys. So it was never, which is, looking back on it now, this is why I think Hawaiians have these weird sizes, like how big the waves are, because it's always an estimate based upon where you are on land, and you're guessing how far out the waves are and how big the whitewash looks. I don't know. I'm making this up.
Yeah,
you never have a perfect gauge. So even though you're looking out, an mile out, you don't really know till you're actually out there.
Right.
And then you're like, oh, okay, whoa, look how big this is now. So
I mean, I usually need to see a person on a wave.
Yeah,
when you roll up to some breakout in the middle of the ocean, you have just no idea. You're like, right. That looks probably nothing. It looks fine. And then you're actually on it, or you see someone on it. You're like, oh, wow, okay. When there's no other kind of visual markers, when it's just out there. But back to the original question about women.
Okay. I was young, and I didn't really think in those terms like I do now. Like I go out now and I how many women are out at this break? Oh, 0. Oh, 2. Now I think about it. I didn't used to think about it. And like I say,
why do you think about it now?
Because
how does it even come up in your mind?
Because of, I feel like this is a longer discussion. Well, because I came through a much more activist period in my life. I feel like I had a political coming of age in New York. I had a queer coming of age in New York where, you just realize, oh, wait a second, there's systemic patriarchy. There's systemic racism. There's systemic this and that, and it's built
and it
into
infiltrates all the spaces.
Yeah, infiltrates. So growing up, I did feel, there's more boys in the water than girls, but again, it wasn't as crowded as it is now. So you didn't feel the pressure of having to battle a guy for a wave. There was only once in my mind that I remember surfing with a bunch of neighborhood boys. And we were just like in our early teen years. So the guys were just starting to get a little bit more like, hogging the waves and getting a little bit more sassy. And so I remember just cutting in on this guy, like, fuck it, I'm just going to paddle in front of this guy. And then all the other guys went, yay! And then I was like, yeah, I just cut in on that guy. But it was neighborhood kids, so they all laughed it off and it was fine. Right. But that was the only time where I felt like I was kind of like jockeying for a position. And through my teen years, like through high school, I surfed, through college, I surfed. I would just go out to my home break, which was usually empty. I could surf empty at my home break late in the afternoon, enjoy the waves all by myself, enjoy the sunset all by myself. Sometimes I would go really, really early in the morning to like Ala Moana Bowls or something. And you could go early in the morning and there wouldn't be a bunch of people already out. Right. Like I would go before, You
could actually be the first one out. I feel like it's so hard. There's always someone else out.
Yeah, no, you could do it in those days. Like I remember going to Sandy Beach with some friends. We woke up at 5 a.m. We got into the water. It's still, we were the only 3 people out. The water's beautiful. The sun's just coming up. Like you could enjoy it back. I'm talking about, this is the 80s. I was in high school in the 80s.
Right. It was interesting, this idea of like, do you feel that now with this kind of more political consciousness, maybe ruins it because now there's too much awareness for it as opposed to this innocence? It's that in conjunction with the idea of there being less people. So the resource of the wave is plentiful. So there isn't as much kind of like competition. So with the kind of like bad waves, less waves, how competitive New Yorkers also can be, like in terms of our temperament. Maybe that also makes it, the awareness of it is much more astute. But the idea that as a kid, there's an innocence to it on so many levels, right?
Yeah.
Those dynamics might not have, been a factor. And also just the idea of the local quality of it. So it's like people, it's not like, New York. In Rockaway, I feel like you run it. I feel like in New York, you still run into the same people, you kind of know the community visually at least. And, I feel like you can, you still have that sense, but I imagine before and when people weren't moving around as much, there really was a sense of home break. Like you knew, like everyone in this break lives on that block over there, or whatever it was,
Right.
And so there was a very like personal relationship that people had to each other.
Yeah.
And I also wonder why more boys were in the water at the time. And this also, I think we can launch into your own kind of studies of Hawaiian culture. Surf culture in Hawaii and kind of like the gender. The diverse, gender diversity in its history, but why even in your time, like maybe that's the story, like that it's outside of just your own relationship to it. It's like, why were there so few girls in the water?
I don't know. I know there must be a story there, and I think probably maybe an older generation of women would be able to tell that story because when I was, a tween. The women's pro circuit had just started, right? So Rel Sun and Margot Oberg and all those old timers, like my family actually went to a North Shore surf contest. And we drove out to Sunset Beach And I couldn't, you couldn't see fucking anything, like humongous waves pounding out, like the sound of huge crashing North Shore waves.
Oh my God, incredible.
Amazing. And, I couldn't even see the surface. I couldn't tell what was going on up there, but I just remember us going out there. I don't even think I saw a surfer walk up onto the beach at that point. Like, I didn't even know what was going on. Anyway.
Or the beach is also so crowded, like you couldn't really get a good vantage point.
Yeah. And just trying to find a surfer out in that playing field of tremendous, like breaking waves and different peaks and all this stuff. Anyway.
Oh my God.
So, there was those women to look up to, but I didn't see those women in the water, especially, where I was. So I think there was a lot smaller percentage of women in the water. Like, I think that it's been male dominated since the modern era began. And I am only now recently tracking down how that came about. I mean, I don't want to tangentially go too far down that rabbit hole unless there's, we can touch on it. But, it happens at sort of the beginning of the 20th century, basically Duke's generation. And, women pretty much disappear from the lineup, from Hawaiian culture. It pretty much dies off. And for different reasons. There's a lot of different reasons why. And it's not from the missionaries per se, which is usually how people kind of chalk it. The missionaries didn't want people to surf. It's not exactly how it went down. But so since the modern era, which was very Americanized and very patriarchal, I mean, Western culture is extremely patriarchal, and it defined acceptable culture in Hawaii. So there was all these different layers of culture. The immigrant Asians who came, the Hawaiian culture that was originally there that also had already been adapted to Western culture from the mid 19th century through the royalty. The royalty actively embraced Western conventions, the way to govern, monetary policy. Like, there's a lot of stuff that they willingly adopted in order to stay current with other global powers. The Hawaiian royalty was actually very savvy. They were very interesting. They did not just get taken over, like sort of commonly thought that what happened to Hawaii. They had their own agency for a long time, and they did these deals with various Western and European powers, the Americans, the French, the English, the Germans, Russians, even, who had come in.
Right. What year did Hawaii get folded into?
It was sort of a gradual process, but the takeover, there was a takeover by the U.S. military in 1893. And that was when, I don't want to bore anyone, but the history is basically, there was a group of American business people some of them were the descendants of the first missionaries who came to Hawaii earlier in the 19th century. So these are like the children and grandchildren of the very first missionaries who were born and raised in Hawaii, then educated separately in their own school, Punahou, which is a very famous school in the islands, and then sent to the East Coast to get their Ivy League education or private school education, where they were kind of indoctrinated into this, Eurocentric way of thinking that white males at the top of the pyramid should run the world. So they returned to Hawaii from their East Coast educations and then said, okay, how are we going to make money, guys?
How do we capitalize on what we have?
How do we capitalize? And what was going on during this period of, in the 19th century? Well, look at the agricultural system of the South. Look at the crops of the South, how wealthy the South was. So they took these ideas and brought them back to Hawaii. So what is the first crop that they started to plant in Hawaii? Sugar. Sugar is the slave crop. Sugar started the slave trade in the Americas. Right? So they came back with these ideas.
Sugar and cotton, right?
Sugar first. Cotton comes a little bit later in the United States, actually.
I know, like the triangle, the famous triangle of the sugar, the goods that it got converted to from the Caribbean to Europe, Africa, and then there's like rum. Rum was a big part of that. And
Yeah, I mean, there was a bunch of crops, right? That started it. But I believe that originally sugar was the one that took off, especially in South America and the Caribbean. And then the Americans started with sugar, and then they switched over to cotton in a lot of places. So but whatever. How many years did that go on for? 400 years? How long was the slave trade?
Yeah.